Imagine standing at the edge of a peaceful lake. The sun dips low on the horizon, casting warm gold across the water. A soft breeze ripples the surface, and everything feels calm, timeless. But what if I told you this beauty hides a secret? What if, beneath those gentle waves, there were streets, homes, schools, and shops, the remains of an entire community that once thrived? This is not a myth, and it is not a rare occurrence. Across the United States, more than 200 vibrant towns built, owned, and sustained by African Americans were deliberately wiped off the map. Their land was seized. Their buildings were torn down or simply left to drown under newly constructed lakes, reservoirs, and dams. The official explanation was always progress, public works, flood control, electricity. But behind the blueprints and the political speeches, there was something else, an unspoken determination to erase these communities from history. These towns were more than just dots on a map. They were the result of grit, resilience, and a dream of independence after generations of slavery. In the decades after the Civil War, Black Americans who had been denied every opportunity built spaces where they could be safe, where their children could learn, and where their hard work could turn into generational wealth. Many succeeded beyond what anyone expected. They opened businesses, ran schools, cultivated farmland, and created thriving economies that rivaled those of their white neighbors. But success did not go unnoticed. Resentment grew in the shadows. People who could not accept the sight of formerly enslaved men and women surpassing them in prosperity and influence began to look for ways to undermine that progress. And they found powerful allies in the laws, in the courts, and in government agencies. Using eminent domain laws and massive infrastructure projects, officials seized land from black families, often offering little or no compensation. Whole neighborhoods were uprooted. Churches and schools that had taken decades to build were abandoned. Then came the flooding. Once the water rose, all that remained were memories and, in time, even those began to fade. Today, families picnic by the shorelines of these man-made lakes. Boats glide over the same waters that cover the streets where children once played. And most visitors have no idea what lies beneath. This is not just about what was lost, it is about what we were never told. It is about erasure on a scale so vast that it has shaped the economic and cultural landscape of America for generations. In this video, we are going to dive beneath the surface literally and figuratively to uncover the truth about these hidden histories. We will explore the stories of the towns, the people, and the forces that conspired to make them disappear. If you believe history should be told in full, not just the parts that are comfortable, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Together, we can bring these buried stories back into the light. When freedom finally came at the end of the Civil War, it did not arrive as a neatly wrapped gift. For millions of African Americans who had endured generations of enslavement, the promise of liberty came without land, without wealth, and without the security that most Americans took for granted. Yet from the ashes of that injustice, they began to build. They took what little they had, skills learned under oppression, traditions passed down in secret, and a determination that could not be broken, and started to create something entirely new. In small pockets across the country, they founded communities where they could live without the constant fear of violence, where their children could be educated, and where their hard work could bear fruit for future generations. The years following emancipation were a time of intense creativity and resolve. Freedmen and women understood that survival was not enough. They needed to thrive if their children and grandchildren were to have a different life. They purchased land, often pooling resources with neighbors to buy larger plots. They built modest homes at first, using wood they cut themselves or bricks they made by hand. Soon, Those homes were joined by churches that doubled as meeting halls and schools. Education became a cornerstone of these new towns, because knowledge was power. And for people who had been denied the right to read or write, every lesson carried revolutionary weight. Businesses began to take shape along dusty main streets. A blacksmith shop run by a skilled craftsman might sit next to a general store owned by a local family, which in turn might be down the road from a tailor's shop or a café. Many of these businesses served both black and white customers, proving that the quality of goods and services did not depend on the color of one's skin. Farmers grew crops that not only fed their families, but could be sold for profit at nearby markets. Some towns even formed their own banks, lending money to residents to help them expand their farms or start new enterprises. The sense of self-reliance was not just economic. It was cultural and spiritual. These communities fostered a deep sense of belonging. Everyone knew each other's names and families. Neighbors looked after one another's children. When a home was damaged by a storm, the community rebuilt it together. Sundays were filled with the sound of choirs, and weekdays buzzed with the activity of classrooms and small shops. In a time when the wider world was hostile to their progress, these towns became sanctuaries of dignity and hope. In places like Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, later known as Black Wall Street, and Eatonville, Florida, success was undeniable. Greenwood boasted luxurious hotels, theaters, and a bustling business district that rivaled those in much larger cities. Eatonville thrived as one of the first self-governing all-black municipalities in the United States. These towns were living proof that, given the opportunity, African Americans could not only match but surpass the economic achievements of many white communities. And that truth made them targets. The prosperity of these communities stood in direct contrast to the false narratives used to justify centuries of oppression. For those invested in maintaining a strict racial hierarchy, the rise of black towns was not simply inconvenient, it was threatening. White neighbors who had once dismissed the idea of black success now found themselves competing with it. This competition bred resentment. And resentment, when mixed with the political and legal systems of the time, became a dangerous force. Jim Crow laws and discriminatory practices soon emerged to keep black prosperity in check. Banks outside these communities refused loans to black applicants, hoping to limit their growth. Segregation laws kept them out of certain markets and restricted access to public services. Land that had been carefully cultivated for decades was targeted by predatory speculators and local officials who sought to take it through legal loopholes. Still, the people in these towns adapted. They built parallel systems, their own schools, their own businesses, their own networks of trade, and continued to rise despite the odds. It is important to understand that this progress was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices made by people who refused to accept the limits imposed on them. They valued education as a pathway to freedom, entrepreneurship as a shield against exploitation, and community solidarity as their greatest source of strength. These values were woven into daily life, passed down through generations, and defended fiercely whenever they were challenged. Yet history shows us that such determination, while admirable, was not always enough to protect what had been built. As these towns grew wealthier and more influential, they became targets for forces far more organized than local prejudice. Political leaders, business interests, and even government agencies began to view these thriving black communities as obstacles to their own agendas. Sometimes it was about land that was suddenly deemed valuable for industry or development. Sometimes it was about dismantling a symbol of black achievement that challenged the status quo. The groundwork for the tragedies that would follow was laid in these years of progress. The very success that made these towns special also made them vulnerable. They had proven that freedom could be more than a word on paper. It could be lived, and it could flourish. But in a society still deeply divided by race, that flourishing was seen by some not as a shared national victory, but as a threat to be managed, contained, or erased. What happened next? The violence. The displacement. The flooding of entire towns cannot be understood without first knowing what was lost. These communities were more than lines on a census form. They were homes where parents tucked their children in at night, schools where young minds opened to new possibilities, streets where neighbors exchanged greetings and goods, and places where dreams were not only imagined but pursued. To erase them was to erase decades of hope, ambition, and achievement. And that is exactly what happened. The lakes and reservoirs we see today, tranquil and inviting, conceal not only buildings and streets, but also the stories of people who believed in a better future and worked tirelessly to make it real. Their legacy deserves more than to be forgotten beneath the water. It deserves to be told, remembered, and understood, because only by knowing the full truth can we begin to grasp the weight of what was taken. In the years when these communities were finding their footing and beginning to flourish, the progress they achieved did not happen in the shadows. It was visible to anyone who cared to look: the neatly kept streets, the hum of commerce in the marketplaces, the proud faces of children in freshly pressed school clothes walking to class each morning. For the residents, these signs of growth were a source of pride, proof that the sacrifices of the first generation after emancipation had not been in vain. But for many white neighbors living just beyond the borders of these towns, those same signs were interpreted through a lens clouded by prejudice and fear. The idea that formerly enslaved people could match, and in some cases surpass, their own levels of prosperity clashed with beliefs that had been instilled over centuries. In a society built on the assumption of racial hierarchy, black success was not simply unexpected, it was, to some, intolerable. This resentment often began quietly. It might be whispered over fences, exchanged in hushed conversations at general stores, or muttered in private gatherings. But as the prosperity of these black towns became more evident, the resentment grew louder and more organized. In some places, white residents withdrew their business from black-owned establishments, attempting to choke off the flow of revenue. In others, they used political influence to pass ordinances or create zoning laws that restricted the expansion of these communities. It was not enough for them to have their own neighborhoods and businesses. They wanted to ensure that black communities remained limited in scope and ambition. The hostility could also be personal, manifesting in acts meant to intimidate and remind black residents that their position in society was still considered precarious. Families who had worked tirelessly to pay off their land might suddenly find their property lines challenged, their deeds questioned, or their tax assessments raised to unaffordable levels. White landowners nearby could file frivolous legal claims, forcing black families into court battles that drained their resources. Even small, such as harassment at markets or deliberate damage to crops and livestock, served as constant reminders that the success of these communities was under scrutiny. And then there were the moments when resentment exploded into violence. Across the country, there were instances where rumors or false accusations against a black individual served as the spark for larger attacks. Entire neighborhoods could be burned in a single night, homes reduced to ashes, businesses looted beyond repair. These eruptions of violence were often excused or overlooked by local authorities, reinforcing the message that black prosperity could be undone at any moment and that there would be no justice for those who lost everything. For many survivors, the trauma was not just in the destruction itself, but in the knowledge that the very systems meant to protect them were either indifferent or complicit. While physical violence left the most visible scars, systemic measures were just as devastating over time. Governments at the local, state, and federal levels began to implement policies that directly undermined black economic and social progress. Under the guise of public safety or modernization, officials could seize land for infrastructure projects, reroute roads away from thriving districts, or deny funding to schools and public services in black communities. Discriminatory lending practices ensured that it was nearly impossible for black entrepreneurs to secure the capital needed to grow their businesses. Segregation laws locked them out of lucrative markets and restricted their mobility, keeping the boundaries of their success tightly drawn. These actions were not random or coincidental. They were part of a broader pattern and unspoken understanding among those in power that the advancement of black communities posed a challenge to the social order they sought to preserve. The tools varied from one region to another. In some places, it was legal loopholes and property seizures. In others, it was intimidation and the threat of mob violence. Elsewhere, it was deliberate economic isolation. But the goal was the same: to ensure that black progress never reached a point where it could fundamentally alter the balance of power. What made this resentment particularly destructive was its persistence. Even in times when racial violence subsided in public view, the underlying attitudes remained embedded in policy and practice. A black farmer who managed to double his yield might still be denied a fair price for his crops. A schoolteacher in a thriving black district might still be paid less than her white counterparts in neighboring towns. A successful business owner might find his supply lines mysteriously disrupted or his permits delayed without explanation. These subtle, sustained pressures worked in tandem with more overt acts to gradually erode the foundations of prosperity that had taken decades to build. For the residents of these communities, resilience became both a necessity and a way of life. They found ways to adapt, creating informal networks of trade, pooling resources to finance each other's ventures, and teaching their children not just academic skills, but also the knowledge of how to navigate a world that often seemed determined to keep them in their place. Yet even the most resourceful strategies could not fully counter the combined weight of systemic suppression and targeted hostility. The resentment toward these communities was not only about money or land. It was about the symbolism of their success. Every thriving black town was a living contradiction to the myths that had justified centuries of inequality. Each new business, each well-maintained home, each student graduating with honors stood as quiet but undeniable evidence that the limitations imposed by society were artificial. And for those invested in maintaining those limitations, erasure, whether through law, economics, or force, became a tempting solution. This is why the later destruction and flooding of so many of these towns cannot be seen in isolation. It was not simply a matter of infrastructure needs or urban planning. It was the culmination of decades of resentment and deliberate obstruction. A final act that ensured these communities would no longer stand as proof of what could be achieved in the face of adversity. The waters that eventually covered their streets did more than hide buildings. They buried the memory of a challenge to the old order. A challenge that had been met not with fair competition, but with suppression. And in understanding this, we see that the lakes and reservoirs of today are not just geographic features, they are monuments to what was taken, and to the enduring struggle to reclaim the truth. Even as these communities demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of resentment and hostility, they were forced to navigate a legal and social landscape carefully engineered to keep their progress contained. The same government that proclaimed liberty and equality often became an active participant in limiting those ideals when it came to African Americans. After the Civil War, the law was not an impartial force standing above prejudice. In many places, it was the hand that gave prejudice its reach. Newly enacted statutes and local ordinances, crafted under the guise of maintaining order or protecting public welfare, were often designed with one unspoken purpose: to ensure that black mobility, both physical and economic, remained constrained. Travel, something so ordinary for others, was layered with barriers for black families. Segregated transportation meant being denied access to certain railway cars or buses, forcing them to endure longer, more expensive, or less safe routes. Residency restrictions kept black families from moving into neighborhoods that offered better schools or safer streets. No matter how much they could afford to pay, Some cities passed sundown laws, warning that black residents were not permitted to remain within town limits after dark, turning entire regions into off-limits territory. These measures were not only about physical movement, they reinforced the message that opportunity itself was bounded, and those boundaries were policed by law as much as by social custom. In the economic realm, the restrictions were equally suffocating. Black farmers found themselves excluded from agricultural cooperatives that could have given them better prices for their crops. Licensing requirements for certain trades were applied selectively, making it nearly impossible for black artisans, shopkeepers, to operate legally without paying excessive fees or enduring endless bureaucratic delays. Access to credit, already limited by discriminatory lending practices, was further throttled by laws that gave white lenders disproportionate power in disputes. Contracts could be voided on flimsy grounds, and black property owners often faced higher taxes or sudden reassessments designed to push them into foreclosure. Segregation, too, was not simply a matter of who could sit where or which schools children could attend. It was a deeply entrenched system that dictated the quality of resources a community could access. Schools for black children were chronically underfunded, receiving outdated textbooks, inadequate facilities, and fewer teachers. Public services like sanitation, road maintenance, and emergency response were allocated unevenly, with black neighborhoods often receiving the least attention. Hospitals were segregated, with black patients relegated to overcrowded wards or denied care altogether, making even basic health care an uphill battle. The courts, which should have been a safeguard, often served as another barrier in disputes over land, contracts, or personal safety. The word of a black citizen was frequently discounted in favor of a white counterpart, regardless of evidence. Laws that should have applied equally were bent or ignored depending on the race of those involved. In criminal cases, all white juries became instruments of injustice, delivering verdicts that reflected prejudice rather than truth. These legal structures were not accidents of oversight. They were the product of deliberate design, ensuring that even when African Americans managed to build something of value, the framework around them could be used to take it away. Social customs reinforced the legal constraints, operating as an unwritten code that could be just as punitive. Breaking these customs, something as small as speaking too assertively in a business negotiation, wearing clothes deemed too fine, or attempting to purchase property in a white neighborhood could provoke swift backlash. In communities where the law might be too slow or too subtle, social enforcement took the form of economic boycotts, public shaming, and in some cases, direct intimidation. Employers could be pressured into firing black workers who were seen as too ambitious, while landlords might refuse to rent to families whose children excelled in school for fear they might seek more opportunity elsewhere. These intertwined legal and social systems created a cage with invisible bars. They did not always require dramatic acts to be effective. The constant, grinding weight of restriction could wear down even the most determined individuals. Opportunities that should have been open to all buying property in a desirable location, securing a fair loan, sending a child to a well-funded school were presented like distant landmarks, visible but unreachable. Over time, the limits placed on individual lives compounded into generational barriers, shaping the trajectory of entire communities. The irony was that many of the same laws and customs that restricted black advancement were defended as measures to preserve peace and stability. Yet in truth, they preserved only the imbalance of power. A black entrepreneur might be celebrated in their own community for opening a successful store. But outside that circle, the very existence of such success could trigger efforts to shut it down through zoning changes, licensing denials, or sudden public improvement projects that required demolition. Each time progress began to gather momentum, the machinery of restriction could be activated to slow it again. For the communities that had worked tirelessly to establish themselves after emancipation, this was an exhausting reality. They were not only building businesses, schools, and homes, they were building them while constantly defending against a system that sought to dismantle their work piece by piece. Every triumph carried with it the knowledge that it could be undone by a single ordinance, court ruling, or orchestrated act of exclusion. This legal and social scaffolding of segregation did not merely limit where people could go or what they could earn. It shaped the very narrative of what was possible. Children growing up in these towns were taught to dream, but they also learned early that their dreams would be forced to fit within the confines of a world that had been deliberately narrowed. And yet, in the face of these constraints, many still pushed against the boundaries, carving out spaces of autonomy and dignity wherever they could. The story of these communities is as much about the brilliance and tenacity required to build under such conditions as it is about the restrictions themselves. But to understand why so many of these towns eventually disappeared beneath the waters of lakes and reservoirs, we must first understand the depth of the system that hemmed them in. The flooding did not occur in a vacuum. It was the final chapter in a much longer history of constriction, a history in which the law and the weight of social expectation worked hand in hand to ensure that black prosperity, no matter how impressive, remained always at risk. The pressures of legal restrictions, social barriers, and constant economic sabotage left many black communities walking a tightrope, balancing progress against the threat of sudden ruin. For some towns, that ruin came not through the slow erosion of opportunity, but in a single night of terror. These were moments when resentment turned to open violence, when rumors or manufactured grievances sparked attacks that left entire neighborhoods in ashes. What had been built through decades of hard work could vanish in hours, replaced by smoldering ruins and shattered lives. Families fled with nothing but the clothes they wore. Business owners stood before the charred remains of shops they had poured their souls into, and schools that had been the pride of the community became piles of rubble. These racial massacres were not random outbursts of chaos. They were often coordinated, with perpetrators shielded by the silence or complicity of local authorities. In their aftermath, the survivors were rarely compensated, their land sometimes claimed by others under the pretense of abandonment. Even in towns that managed to avoid such violence, the threat loomed over every sign of prosperity. The knowledge that success could provoke destruction forced communities into a constant state of vigilance, guarding not only their property, but the very image of their progress. Yet history shows that even vigilance could not shield them from what was coming next. As the decades passed and the country turned its attention toward modernization, a new, less overt but equally devastating wave of erasure swept across the land. This time, the destruction came not from mobs with torches, but from officials with maps, engineers with blueprints, and leaders who spoke of progress and public good. The language was different. No one claimed these projects were acts of punishment, but the result for the affected black towns was eerily similar to the aftermath of a massacre. Government agencies, often with federal backing, began identifying sites for dams, reservoirs, and artificial lakes. On paper, these were ventures to provide water, generate power, or control flooding. In reality, the choice of where to build them was rarely neutral. Time and again, thriving black communities were marked for removal, their land designated as the footprint of the next great public works project. Residents were told they had no choice. Their homes would be acquired through eminent domain, their businesses dismantled, their churches and schools abandoned. The promises were often framed in the language of benefit. Officials spoke of how the new lake would bring tourism, or how the dam would serve as an economic engine for the region. But for the people whose homes lay in the flood zone, there was no future in these promises. Compensation for seized property was frequently far below market value. making it impossible for displaced families to rebuild at the same level elsewhere. In many cases, land that had been passed down for generations, the tangible result of decades of perseverance through systemic discrimination, was gone forever, its history sealed beneath the water. Once the flooding began, the transformation was swift and irreversible. The streets where children had played, the corner stores where neighbors gathered, the fields that had fed the community all disappeared under a rising tide. Churches that had stood for a century, built plank by the hands of those who had been denied entry to others, were left to rot beneath the waves. Cemeteries, the final resting places of ancestors whose survival had made the towns possible, were sometimes relocated in haste, but often left where they were, submerged and forgotten. In the end, maps were redrawn, the old names erased, and visitors to the new lakes might never guess that a town had once stood there at all. The narrative of progress became the official story, printed in newspapers and celebrated in ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Photographs of smiling dignitaries standing before newly built dams replaced the images of displaced families whose loss was never acknowledged. In history books, the lakes were presented as symbols of modern engineering, their creation divorced from the human cost. What remained unspoken was the continuity between the destruction wrought by racial violence and that carried out under the banner of infrastructure. In Boses, black communities were systematically removed from land they had made valuable, and in both cases, the perpetrators were insulated from accountability. For the people who had lived in these towns, the trauma was layered. It was not only the pain of losing their homes, but the deep wound of seeing that loss framed as a public good. Children who had been taught to take pride in their community now had to watch it vanish beneath the water. Learning early that even the most beautiful and well-tended places could be erased if they stood in the path of someone else's vision. Elders who had survived earlier eras of open hostility were forced to reckon with the reality that destruction could now come dressed in the language of opportunity. This cycle of displacement, whether through violence or progress, was devastating not just to the physical spaces of these towns but to their generational wealth. Land ownership had been one of the few avenues for African Americans to build and pass on assets. And the loss of that land meant starting over from nothing. The communities that were scattered by these projects often found themselves in areas with fewer resources, weaker social networks, and limited economic opportunity. In many cases, the bonds that had sustained them through earlier trials were severed, leaving individuals to fend for themselves in unfamiliar and often unwelcoming environments. Over time, the lakes and reservoirs became ordinary features of the landscape, their origins forgotten by those who visited to fish, boat, or swim. But for the descendants of those displaced, these waters hold a different meaning. They are quiet, reflective surfaces that conceal entire histories, the last traces of towns that dared to thrive in a world that wanted to contain them. Standing at the shoreline, it is possible to imagine the streets that once ran there, to picture the houses and gardens, the school bells ringing in the morning, the laughter spilling from a Saturday gathering. Beneath the ripples lies a testament to both the heights these communities reached and the forces that conspired to erase them. And in telling their story, we challenge the narrative that their disappearance was inevitable, insisting instead that it was the result of deliberate choices that turned thriving towns into forgotten ruins hidden under the water. By the time the wave of so-called progress began sweeping across the nation, the communities that had survived decades of legal constraints, social hostility, economic sabotage, and even outright violence were already well aware of how fragile security could be. Yet nothing quite prepared them for the cold precision of the next chapter, the moment when loss came not in the chaos of a mob or the heat of a torch, but in neatly typed letters, official surveys, and stamped approvals. These were not raids in the night. They were plans drawn in boardrooms, public hearings framed as opportunities for civic input, and polite but final notices that a family's home and land were needed for the greater good. It was a language designed to sound reasonable, even noble. But beneath the carefully chosen words lay a familiar reality: removal, erasure, and the stripping away of generations of hard-earned progress. Officials spoke of infrastructure, public safety, recreation, and economic development. They pointed to maps showing the path of a future dam, the boundaries of a reservoir, or the footprint of a new public facility. They talked of jobs created during construction, of tourism that might someday flourish, of improved water supply for the region. Rarely did they speak of the human cost, and when they did, it was couched in vague assurances that fair compensation would be provided. For many black communities, that phrase became a bitter joke. Fairness was measured by standards that ignored the intangible value of a home built by a grandfather's hands, a field planted by generations, or a church that had stood as a beacon in times of hardship. Compensation, when it came at all, was often a fraction of true value, enough to leave, but never enough to rebuild on equal footing. The process was almost always one-sided. Decisions about where to place these projects were made without meaningful representation from those most affected, and the chosen locations somehow, time and again, fell on thriving black towns. This pattern was not coincidence. It was the intersection of power and prejudice, where the absence of political clout made these communities easier targets. Eminent domain, the legal tool that allowed the government to seize private land for public use, was wielded with a force that left little room for resistance. On paper, it was a neutral instrument of progress. In practice, it disproportionately uprooted those whose histories were already marked by displacement. Families watched as surveyors walked the perimeters of their land, measuring boundaries that would soon be erased. In some cases, construction crews began their work before all residents had even left. The sound of machinery and the smell of freshly turned earth mingling with the weight of final goodbyes. Those who refused to leave quietly found themselves in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against them. Judges cited the law, reminding them that public need outweighed private interest. In those sterile chambers, the deep history of the land, its stories, its sacred spaces, its role in binding a community together was reduced to numbers on an appraisal form. When the moment came to leave, it was rarely a dignified departure. Belongings were packed in haste, sometimes under the watchful eye of local deputies. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades were scattered to distant towns or cities, often with no plan beyond finding a roof to sleep under. Businesses that had anchored the community for generations closed their doors forever. Schools were abandoned, their playgrounds falling silent, their classrooms left to gather dust until the rising water or the bulldozer erased them completely. What made this displacement particularly cruel was the way it was framed as benevolent. Officials insisted that these sacrifices were necessary for the advancement of the region, that everyone would ultimately benefit. But the benefits almost never flowed back to those who had lost the most. The jobs created by construction often went to outsiders. The economic boost from tourism enriched surrounding areas, not the former residents who had been forced to start over elsewhere. The reservoirs that promised clean water sometimes bypassed the very communities they had replaced. In the years after the waters rose or the new facilities opened, the memory of what had been there began to fade from public consciousness. Visitors came to fish, to boat, to picnic, unaware that beneath the water lay the streets of a once vibrant town, or that the grassy field beside a dam had once been a neighborhood alive with music and laughter. Official histories mentioned the projects as triumphs of engineering, with little or no acknowledgement of the communities erased to make them possible. The land's new identity was cemented, while its old one was quietly buried. For the displaced, the loss echoed far beyond the moment they turned the key in their front door for the last time. The absence of land ownership meant the collapse of generational wealth, the same wealth that could have funded higher education for children, expanded family businesses, or provided security in hard times. The scattering of neighbors weakened social networks that had offered mutual support in the face of systemic barriers, traditions tied to specific places' annual festivals. Church homecomings. Even the planting of certain fields became impossible to sustain. Without a physical center to return to, the cohesion of these communities dissolved over time. Perhaps the most enduring wound was the knowledge that this was not an inevitable loss, but a choice made by those in power. Other sites could have been chosen. Other designs could have spared at least some of the land. Yet time and again, the places marked for improvement seemed to be the same ones that had managed to thrive despite all odds. The same ones that had refused to fade quietly into the margins. This was not progress in its purest sense, but a reshaping of the landscape that prioritized certain histories while erasing others. Today, the waters may be calm, the dams steady, the parks well kept, but beneath the surface lies a different story, one of resilience met with dispossession, of achievement answered with erasure. To stand on those shores with knowledge of the past is to feel the weight of what is missing, to understand that the beauty of the scene is inseparable from the injustice that created it. It is a reminder that the language of the public good can be twisted into a tool for exclusion, and that the cost of progress is not measured solely in dollars or concrete poured, but in the lives uprooted and the histories submerged. Among the many stories hidden beneath the water's surface, a few have managed to echo through the years, whispered by descendants or pieced together by historians determined to keep them from vanishing entirely. Oscarville, Georgia, was one such place. In the early 20th century, it was a thriving community where black families owned land, ran businesses, farmed the fertile soil, and built lives that promised stability and dignity. But in 1912, violence, terror, and forced expulsion emptied the town almost overnight. Families left with nothing, their homes abandoned, their land taken over by others. Decades later, when officials sought a site for a massive reservoir, Oscarville's location was deemed ideal. The damming of the Chattahoochee River created Lake Lanier, and the remains of the once prosperous town were swallowed by water, its history replaced in public memory by boating marinas, vacation cabins, and weekend getaways. Those who visit today might never guess that beneath the waves lie the roads, buildings, and untold stories of a displaced people. Farther west, in Alabama, another community met a similar fate. Van was a quiet but self-sustaining black town, where residents had built homes and cultivated land that could feed future generations. The sense of safety there had been hard-won, forged through years of working the soil and establishing businesses despite the challenges of segregation and systemic inequality. But when plans emerged for the Walter F. George Reservoir, also known as Lake Eufaula, the town found itself in the path of progress, once again defined by someone else's priorities. Government representatives arrived with surveys and acquisition papers, assuring residents that the flooding was necessary for regional benefit. The reality was a wave of displacement. People were given little time to prepare, and the compensation offered could not match the value of what was lost. As the waters rose, the fields that had sustained families disappeared, and the church bells that had once called the community together fell silent beneath the lake. Even larger in scale was the transformation of the Tennessee Valley during the mid-20th century. The Tennessee Valley Authority, established during the New Deal era, was tasked with modernizing a region plagued by economic hardship. Its mission was ambitious: control flooding, generate electricity, and create jobs. On paper, it promised progress. In practice, it demanded sacrifice, and the burden of that sacrifice fell unevenly. Entire towns, including many predominantly black communities, were marked for removal to make way for dams, reservoirs, and other infrastructure, families were told they were part of a grand national project. Yet the benefits, the jobs, the reliable electricity, the economic growth often bypassed those who had given up the most. In the Tennessee Valley, the scale of displacement was staggering. Thousands were uprooted, their homes demolished or left to be consumed by the water. Cemeteries were sometimes relocated with haste, leaving behind graves that were deemed too difficult to move. The Tivus projects were celebrated as symbols of American ingenuity. But little space was given to acknowledge the communities erased in their creation. For black families in particular, the loss was compounded by the fact that land ownership had been one of the few tangible ways to build generational wealth in the face of discriminatory systems. To lose that land, and to lose it without the means to start anew on equal footing, was to see decades of perseverance washed away in an instant. What connects Oscarville and the Tiva projects is not just the physical flooding of land, but the deliberate choices that placed these communities in harm's way. There were always alternatives, other sites that could have been chosen. But time and again the final decision came at the expense of places where black prosperity had taken root. The language of public good provided political cover, while the true human cost was quietly ignored. Maps were redrawn, lakes renamed, and the histories of these towns rewritten to fit the narrative of progress. Today, these bodies of water are destinations for leisure. Families gather on their shores, fishing lines ripple the surface, and boats cut clean paths through the blue. Visitors may speak of their beauty without knowing that they are also graveyards of memory, where each submerged road and building tells of a community that was never meant to be forgotten. Beneath Lake Lanier lies the foundation of Oscarville's schoolhouse. Beneath Lake Eufaula lie the church pews of Van. Beneath the reservoirs of the Tennessee Valley lie thousands of untold family stories, each one a chapter in the longer history of resilience met with erasure. The tragedy is not only in the loss itself, but in the way these histories have been hidden from the public eye. Without telling them, the narrative of progress remains incomplete, stripped of the complexity that comes from acknowledging who paid the highest price. The surface of these lakes may seem calm, but their depths hold the weight of unfinished stories that challenge us to question how easily progress can become a mask for displacement, and how often the burdens of that displacement fall along familiar lines. Remembering Oscarville and the countless communities displaced by Tiva projects is not about denying the value of infrastructure or the benefits that reservoirs and dams can bring. It is about demanding honesty in how we tell the story of their creation, and about recognizing that progress should not require the silencing of entire communities. These places were not empty land waiting to be used. They were vibrant, self-sufficient towns built through the hard work and hope of people who refused to let adversity define them. In telling their stories, we restore them to the map, not just the geographic map, but the moral one. We affirm that their lives and labor mattered, that the water which now covers their homes is not just a recreational space, but a reminder of what was lost. And perhaps, in speaking their names aloud, we create a future in which progress is measured not only by what is built, but by what is preserved, protected, and allowed to thrive without fear of being erased. The story of these displaced black communities is not only one of land lost to rising waters or bulldozers, but also one marked by fear, coercion, and violence that preceded the physical removal. For many families, the process of eviction was rushed and brutal, far from the orderly relocations often portrayed in official records. Notices came with little warning, sometimes days or even hours before the deadline, leaving residents scrambling to gather what belongings they could, knowing that resistance could provoke severe consequences. The emotional weight of uprooting entire lives was compounded by the looming threat of racial hostility, a constant presence that shadowed every step of their departure. These eviction notices were often delivered under the watchful eyes of local law enforcement or private security hired to enforce the removal. The message was clear: Compliance was expected, and any hesitation would not be tolerated. For those who hesitated or questioned the fairness of the compensation, intimidation became a tool to break their resolve. Threats ranged from verbal warnings to physical violence, with some families facing harassment or outright attacks aimed at forcing them out. The history of racial violence in the United States was not left behind when these communities faced displacement. It was very much part of the reality, woven into the fabric of their forced exodus. In many cases, residents were given so little time that the logistics of moving became nearly impossible, packing a lifetime of possessions. Closing businesses. Arranging transportation and finding new housing on short notice was a daunting task under any circumstances, but when the process was accelerated and accompanied by threats, it became a nightmare. Families were forced to choose what to take and what to leave behind, often abandoning heirlooms, important documents, and personal treasures because there simply was not time to salvage everything. This loss was more than material. It severed connections to personal and communal history that had been built over generations. The presence of racial violence was not limited to overt physical attacks. Social intimidation, economic retaliation, and psychological pressure were weaponized to compel compliance. Neighbors who resisted were sometimes blacklisted from employment, their businesses boycotted, or their children subjected to bullying and discrimination in new schools. These tactics served to isolate families, making the prospect of staying even more untenable. The fear of reprisal was a powerful force, creating an environment where even legal objections or peaceful protests were met with hostility. Historical accounts reveal instances where eviction notices arrived alongside acts of violence or vandalism. Homes were broken into, windows smashed, and personal property destroyed as a warning to others who might consider defiance. In some communities, churches and community centers, the heart of social life, were targeted to break the spirit of resistance. This violence was not random but calculated, a part of the broader strategy to dismantle black communities systematically. For elders who had survived previous waves of racial terror, the renewed threat was especially painful. They understood that the fight for land and dignity was ongoing, and that the floodwaters or construction crews were not the only forces to be reckoned with. The psychological toll was immense, as the trauma of forced displacement intertwined with memories of past injustices. Stories passed down within families spoke of nights spent awake, guarding property against vandals, or worrying about the safety of loved ones in the face of growing hostility. Children, too, were caught in the turmoil. The disruption of school, the loss of friends and familiar surroundings, and the anxiety felt by their parents created a sense of instability that shaped their early years. Many would carry the scars of these experiences into adulthood, grappling with the loss of a home they never fully knew but had heard about through family stories. The cultural dislocation was profound, as traditions tied to place festivals, community gatherings, rituals were fractured or lost entirely. The social fabric that had sustained these towns for generations was pulled apart under tremendous strain. Community bonds, which had provided support and resilience against systemic discrimination, were weakened or broken as families dispersed. Rebuilding was difficult in new locations where resources were scarce and social networks limited. The psychological impact of sudden displacement, compounded by the violence and threats that accompanied it, left many struggling to regain footing in an uncertain future. The eviction processes were often cloaked in the language of legality and necessity, masking the harsh realities faced by those displaced. Official documents and government statements spoke of eminent domain and public benefit, but behind those words lay stories of coercion and loss that rarely made it into the record. This discrepancy between the official narrative and lived experience speaks to the broader pattern of erasure that defined the fate of these black communities. In reflecting on this painful history, It is crucial to understand that the physical destruction of homes and towns was only part of the story. The psychological warfare, the threats, and the deliberate acceleration of eviction timelines were integral to the process of displacement. These tactics ensured that resistance was difficult, costly, and dangerous, paving the way for the erasure of communities that had already endured so much. Today, when we look upon the calm waters of reservoirs or visit parks where once vibrant towns thrived, we should remember that beneath the surface lies not only submerged land but also stories of families forced from their homes under duress. The echoes of threats and violence may have faded, but the legacy of those forced evictions remains, shaping generations and reminding us that the cost of so-called progress was paid in more than just land and buildings. It was paid in fear, trauma, and the fracture of communities that once stood as beacons of hope and resilience in the face of adversity. The story of Black communities being disproportionately targeted for harmful projects is not confined to history. It is a pattern that has persisted and evolved into the present day, echoing the systemic injustices faced by those earlier towns now submerged beneath lakes and reservoirs. From the very foundations of the United States infrastructure development, these communities were marked as expendable, their lands seized under the guise of progress while others were spared. This was not happenstance, but the result of deeply entrenched racial biases that saw Black neighborhoods as obstacles to be removed rather than vibrant centers of culture and resilience to be preserved. In the early 20th century, as dams, reservoirs, and highways carved new paths across the country, the selection of sites was rarely neutral. The choice to flood or destroy thriving Black towns was strategic, reflecting a broader system of environmental racism that prioritized white communities, growth and safety over Black families, homes and histories. The lakes that now shimmer under the sun, offering recreational escapes to many, hold stories of communities uprooted and erased without fair compensation or consideration. This disparity was rooted in the social and political power that these communities lacked voices unheard in decision-making rooms where their futures were being sealed. This pattern of environmental injustice did not end with the mid-20th century. As society advanced, the forms of displacement and harm became more insidious but remained equally damaging. Toxins, industrial plants, highways, and landfills were frequently placed near or within Black neighborhoods, exposing residents to health hazards and environmental degradation that perpetuated cycles of poverty and illness. The legacy of lost land ownership and wealth from earlier displacements compounded the vulnerability of these communities, making it difficult to resist or relocate. Modern environmental policies often perpetuate this legacy, whether through zoning decisions, infrastructure projects, or resource extraction. Studies have shown that communities of color, particularly Black neighborhoods, continue to face disproportionate exposure to pollutants and hazardous conditions. This ongoing pattern underscores how environmental racism is woven into the fabric of urban planning and development, extending the historic injustices experienced by the towns lost beneath the water. Understanding this connection between past and present is crucial in recognizing that the struggle over land and environmental justice is far from over. The displacement of Escarville and countless other Black communities was an early chapter in a longer story, one that includes battles against new forms of environmental harm and fights for equitable treatment in urban and rural planning. The same systemic forces that allowed whole towns to be drowned for dams now operate in subtler ways, shaping who lives near pollution, who gains access to clean water, and who bears the burden of industrial waste. This legacy also highlights the resilience of Black communities, which, despite being targeted and uprooted, have continuously found ways to organize, advocate, and resist. Grassroots movements today challenge discriminatory policies, push for remediation of contaminated sites, and fight for greater representation in decisions that affect their environments. These efforts draw strength from the history of displacement and dispossession, fueling a determination that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated unchecked. Recognizing the historic pattern of environmental racism invites a broader reflection on how progress has too often been built on the suffering of marginalized communities. The infrastructure that powers cities and supports economies was not created on a blank slate, but atop lands that bore witness to struggles for survival and dignity. The waters covering former black towns are silent testaments to what was sacrificed and what must be remembered. To move toward justice requires more than acknowledgement. It demands concrete action. This means reevaluating current policies to ensure equitable environmental protections, investing in communities that have been historically neglected, and centering the voices of those most affected in decisions about land use and development. It also means preserving and honoring the histories of places lost to displacement, making sure that the stories beneath the water are not forgotten but serve as lessons for the future. In contemplating the serene surface of a reservoir, it is vital to remember the complex history hidden below a history marked by displacement. Environmental harm and ongoing struggles for equity. The pattern of choosing black communities for harmful projects is a thread connecting past and present. A reminder that the fight for environmental justice is deeply intertwined with the fight against racial inequality. As we acknowledge these truths, we take a step closer to a future where progress does not come at the cost of community or dignity, and where the legacies of those who came before are honored rather than erased. Land has long been more than just soil and property for many families. It has symbolized stability, identity, and the promise of a future that could be passed down through generations. For black communities, especially those who had managed to build thriving towns in the shadow of oppression, owning land represented a hard-won victory, a foundation on which they could create wealth, nurture families, and defy the limitations imposed by systemic racism. Yet, when those lands were forcibly taken, submerged, or destroyed, the consequences rippled far beyond the immediate loss of homes or businesses. It struck at the very heart of economic opportunity and generational security, widening an already stark racial wealth gap and locking families into cycles of poverty that are still felt today. Unlike many other communities, black families faced enormous barriers to accumulating wealth, denied access to many forms of education, fair employment, and credit. Land ownership became one of the few reliable ways to build equity and create a legacy that could empower future generations. Land could fund children's education, provide collateral for small businesses, or simply be passed as inheritance to offer a financial cushion that others took for granted. But the forced displacement and erasure of black towns destroyed these avenues almost entirely. When Oscarville in Georgia was flooded to create Lake Lanier, or when Van in Alabama was sacrificed for the Walter F. George Reservoir, entire communities lost their physical and economic foundation, leaving families without the means to sustain or grow their wealth. The loss was not merely physical, but profoundly symbolic and structural. A home or a farm is not just a place to live. It is an asset that accrues value over time. When such assets are seized or destroyed without just compensation, the opportunity to build intergenerational wealth evaporates. This absence has compounded over decades, contributing to a persistent racial wealth gap in the United States, where black households, on average, hold a fraction of the wealth of their white counterparts. The historical confiscation of land and property played a key role in creating this disparity, acting as a significant hurdle that limited upward mobility. Moreover, the psychological and emotional toll of losing one's home and community cannot be understated. For families uprooted from these towns, the trauma of displacement was intertwined with the harsh reality of economic vulnerability. Starting over in unfamiliar places, often with limited resources and support networks, made it difficult to break free from poverty. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Lack of wealth meant fewer opportunities, which in turn made it harder to accumulate assets and build security for the next generation. This systemic trap has affected countless families and has echoes in disparities that remain visible in education, health, and housing today. The erasure of black communities beneath reservoirs and other infrastructure projects also severed ties to cultural heritage and social networks that had nurtured collective strength. Schools, churches, and businesses that formed the backbone of community life vanished, further isolating displaced families and limiting their social capital. Without these anchors, rebuilding economic and social foundations became even more challenging, and the opportunity to pass on a robust legacy was diminished. Yet, despite these losses, resilience persisted. Many families and descendants fought to rebuild their lives, striving to reclaim a sense of pride and security in the face of overwhelming adversity. Oral histories passed down through generations keep alive the memory of what was lost and serve as a testament to the enduring spirit of these communities. These stories remind us that the destruction of land and property was not just an economic blow, but a deep wound to identity and hope. Understanding how land dispossession contributed to the racial wealth gap sheds light on the broader systemic inequalities that continue to shape American society. It challenges the simplistic narratives that attribute poverty solely to individual effort or choices and highlights the long shadow cast by deliberate policies and actions that disrupted wealth building for black families. This recognition is essential for meaningful conversations about equity, reparations, and economic justice. Addressing this legacy requires more than acknowledging past wrongs. It calls for active measures to close wealth gaps through targeted investment, access to affordable housing, educational opportunities, and support for black-owned businesses. It also involves preserving and celebrating the histories of displaced communities, ensuring that their contributions and sacrifices are not forgotten but inform future progress. As we reflect on the submerged cities and flooded towns, we are reminded that the loss of land was more than a historical footnote. It was a pivotal factor that shaped the economic realities of countless families, contributing to disparities that remain entrenched. The waters covering those communities symbolize not only what was physically lost, but also the missed opportunities for generational wealth and security. Recognizing this truth invites a deeper understanding of racial inequality and a renewed commitment to building a more just and equitable future. Beneath the serene surfaces of lakes and reservoirs across the United States lie the forgotten remnants of thriving black communities, their stories long buried beneath decades of silence and water. For years, many of these towns were dismissed as mere folklore, their existence overshadowed by official narratives that portrayed these lands as empty or insignificant before being flooded for so-called progress. But in recent times, a new wave of historians, researchers, and archaeologists has emerged, driven by a shared mission to uncover these submerged towns and rewrite the histories that have been obscured or distorted. Through the power of archives and cutting-edge technology, they are breathing life into stories once thought lost forever, challenging false narratives and restoring dignity to communities erased from maps and memories. The journey to rediscover these hidden histories often begins in archives, where dusty records, old maps, property deeds, newspaper clippings, and personal letters reveal traces of places erased from public memory. Researchers painstakingly sift through these documents, piecing together evidence of communities that thrived before the waters came. In cases like Escarville, Georgia, and Van, Alabama, archival research has uncovered proof of schools, businesses, churches, and farms that once formed the backbone of vibrant black towns. These findings not only confirm oral histories passed down through families, but also contradict the dominant storylines that ignored or downplayed the significance of these places. Yet archival research is just one part of the story. Technological advances have revolutionized how these submerged sites can be explored and documented without disturbing the water or landscape. Underwater archaeologists employ sonar imaging, remote-operated vehicles, and sonar mapping to detect the outlines of streets, building foundations, and other structures resting beneath lake surfaces. This non-invasive technology enables experts to create detailed maps and virtual reconstructions, allowing the public and scholars alike to visualize what was lost and appreciate the scale and complexity of these communities. Digital platforms also play a crucial role in bringing these histories to broader audiences. Virtual reality recreations, interactive maps, and online archives invite people to explore these towns' pasts from anywhere in the world, bridging the gap between history and contemporary understanding. These tools not only educate but foster empathy by connecting individuals to the lived experiences of displaced families and communities. One powerful example is the rediscovery of Seneca Village, a predominantly black settlement in what is now Central Park in New York City. For many years, the narrative suggested that the park was created on empty land, but through archival digging and archaeological investigation, historians uncovered the true story of a vibrant community that was forcibly removed in the 1850s to make way for the park's construction. This revelation challenges long-held assumptions and highlights how easily the histories of marginalized groups can be erased or rewritten. These efforts are not only academic exercises but acts of justice and remembrance. By uncovering the true stories behind submerged towns, researchers are restoring the names, places, and legacies that were deliberately erased through policies of displacement and racial oppression. Community leaders, descendants, and activists often collaborate with scholars to host memorial events, erect markers, and produce documentaries that honor the resilience and contributions of these lost communities. These initiatives ensure that the legacies of those displaced are not forgotten but celebrated and integrated into the broader narrative of American history. Moreover, this work sparks important conversations about how history is recorded, whose stories are told, and the consequences of silence. It forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism and the ways in which infrastructure projects have been used as tools of oppression. It also inspires a more inclusive approach to preserving cultural heritage, one that values all voices and experiences. The rediscovery of submerged black towns through archives and technology offers hope that even erased histories can be recovered and honored. It reminds us that history is not fixed or monolithic, but a living tapestry that can be expanded and corrected. The submerged streets and buildings may lie beneath lakes and reservoirs, but through dedicated research and innovation, their stories are resurfacing, demanding recognition, respect, and remembrance. As these hidden chapters come to light, they enrich our understanding of the past and illuminate the ongoing impact of displacement and systemic inequality. They challenge us to rethink the narratives we accept and to recognize the strength and resilience of communities that refuse to be erased. In doing, they open pathways toward healing and justice, ensuring that the legacy of these lost towns continues to inform and inspire future generations. As we reach the close of this journey into the hidden chapters of America's history, it is clear that uncovering the stories of these lost black communities is only the beginning. Education, advocacy, and preservation stand as the pillars necessary not only to honor those who were displaced and erased, but also to begin the vital work of repairing the damage inflicted across generations. Without deliberate effort to remember, acknowledge, and act, the legacies beneath the water risk fading once more into silence, a silence we can no longer afford. Education is the first step toward justice. By learning about the history of these submerged towns, we confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism, displacement, and the deliberate destruction of thriving communities. Schools, museums, and media have a responsibility to include these stories in curricula and public discourse, so that new generations understand the full scope of American history, not just the sanitized or selective versions. When we educate ourselves and others, we break the cycle of ignorance and denial that allows injustices to persist unseen and unchallenged. Advocacy takes education from awareness into action. It means supporting the efforts of historians, descendants, activists, and community leaders who work tirelessly to preserve records, erect memorials, and demand reparations or policy changes that address the long-term effects of displacement. Advocacy calls on policymakers to recognize the environmental and economic harms caused by these projects and to ensure that current and future infrastructure developments do not repeat these patterns of racial injustice. It means amplifying voices that have historically been marginalized and ensuring that communities affected by past and present harms have a say in decisions impacting their lives and environments. Preservation is about protecting the physical and cultural legacies that remain and finding ways to commemorate what was lost, whether through digital recreations, museums, public art, or designated heritage sites. Preservation creates tangible connections to the past that foster understanding and respect. It is a way to honor the resilience of those who built these communities and to acknowledge the sacrifices they endured. Preservation ensures that the stories of these towns are not forgotten but continue to inspire and educate, becoming part of the shared heritage that shapes our collective identity. Together, education, advocacy, and preservation form a powerful framework for healing and progress. They remind us that while the waters may have covered these communities, the truths beneath them cannot be submerged forever. It is our responsibility to listen, learn, and act so that justice can be served not only in memory but in the policies and practices that shape the future. Thank you for joining me in exploring this important and often overlooked part of history. Your willingness to engage with these stories is a vital step toward change, and I encourage you to continue learning, sharing, and advocating for justice in your own communities. If you found this video meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who need to hear these stories. Together, we can help ensure that the legacies of these lost towns are honored and that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Wishing you all a peaceful night and sweet dreams.